I'm particularly honoured to present here today, not least because I've been following some of the excellent work that the Centre has been engaged with for some years now. In fact, I remember attending a very insightful symposium held at Cardiff on Sharia courts I think about 10 years ago now. And I really enjoyed that, and I learned a great deal. I've also received some wonderful messages from scholars based at the Centre and others interested in the study of British Muslims. I really hope I don't disappoint you all, although if I've got anything to do with it, I probably will. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, as like I mentioned, providing a brief overview of the book, its general themes, and some ethnographic material. It's always quite difficult to summarize a whole book without giving a blow-by-blow account, which of course I'll try to avoid. But I will be breaking down the book according to its chapters and providing an overview of the key points. Hopefully, if anyone is interested, we can then expand on those in the Q&A. Now, in the interest of time and possibly avoiding boredom, the bulk of the presentation will be an exploration of the ethnographic material rather than engaging more closely with theoretical concepts discussed in the book. If I may do that, again, we can pick up on any detail in the Q&A if people wish. Okay, brilliant. So the book is based on ethnographic fieldwork conducted in the town of Luton between 2008 and 2010. That's when the bulk of the sort of ethnographic fieldwork, immersive work was conducted. As you would know, anthropologists, we engage in participant observation. So I spent a lot of intensive time in the town during that period, but have been sort of popping in and out and keeping tabs on things since. It's set in and around Bury Park, or the Bury Park area of the town. Now, Luton has a population of around about 200,000 people, and 19% of that population, according to the last census, of the population is Muslim, and the vast majority of them reside in the Bury Park area, or if they don't reside directly in the Bury Park area, they've got relatives that reside there. They might be in other parts of the town, which is starting to happen more and more now as the community has grown over the years. And the book really explores the lives of young British-born Muslim men of South Asian origin, specifically of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin. Now, I should mention here, I didn't just spend all my time with men, although overwhelmingly it was the case due to lots of, sort of cultural reasons and other sort of logistical reasons. I did also speak to some women as well, and the book is very much sort of also informed by that exposure. The vast majority of my interlocutors in the town were of Pakistani origin, mostly from Azad Kashmir, or the Kashmir region. More specifically, a lot of my interlocutors were from the town of Kotli, which is in Mirpur province, and also Bangladeshis, but to a lesser extent in the town who originated from Sylhet. And broadly, I think that the people I spoke to represented proportionately the makeup of the community in terms of numbers. Okay, so in the book, I suggest that young Muslims in Luton are developing hybridized forms of Islam in an attempt to find alternatives to culturally exclusive state narratives of nationality and citizenship. So young Muslims make a clear distinction between their South Asian Muslim home or community and wider mainstream liberal society, but reject both as totalizing cultural reference points. Instead, they are looking to Islam, its glorious past, and the international Muslim community, or Ummah, as a means of reconciling both the alienating practices of the home and the perceived Islamophobia and defilement of society beyond. By resorting to an abstract re-articulation of Islam, young Muslims were readapting communal identities to suit the social and cultural terrain of Britain, while simultaneously creating a counter-discourse to accepted notions of Britishness and national belonging. Okay, now hopefully everybody can see that image on the screen. This is just a flavor of the kind of sort of residential areas that you'll find in Bury Park. This is a typical road. You can see sort of the transnational reference to Kashmir there with this grocery store. But if you look very clearly, closely, I hope you can see it, at the end of the street is one of the stands for Luton Town Football Club. This is very indicative of the sort of history of this area. Prior to South Asians coming in and moving into the area in the 1960s and onwards, the whole community was pretty much white working class that emerged during the sort of industrial zenith of the town. And of course, football was a very working class sport in the sort of late 19th, early 10th, and throughout the sort of 20th century. So the football club was actually the center of the community previous to the South Asian community that is there presently. It's interesting as well because it's also the bone of contention by certain individuals in the town, not least Tommy Robinson, who was the founder of the EDL, which I'll come to in a moment. But he takes his name, Tommy Robinson, from a football hooligan from the 70s and 80s. His real name is Stephen Lennon. And this is a sort of point of embitterment on his part, because the way he sees it, that his sort of community and his area of the town has been taken over by radical Islam, as he would put it. Okay, so as I said, I'm not going to go through too much of the theoretical themes in detail because we haven't got time for it, and I've already wasted some time on technical glitches. So I'm just going to sort of give you a brief overview of where the work theoretically is situated, and primarily it's situated within a broader debate in the anthropology of Islam. Very briefly, there's a sort of two camps in the anthropology of Islam. One that argues that Islam is a discursive tradition, that it's based on a interpretation through time and space and place of the founding texts of Islam, and for Muslims to be able to, for anthropologists or other sort of sociologists or social scientists to be able to sort of understand Islam and Muslims, one needs to sort of start at the scripture first and then work from there, and how that sort of discursively affects and molds subjectivities. And then we've got another camp that argues that there's too much Islam in the anthropology of Islam. It's too much about text and piety and spirituality and ethical coherence. But actually what we should look at and focus on is the ambivalence, the incoherence, the way that people live their Islam every day. And if we do that, if we apply ethnographic scrutiny, we see that actually most Muslims are constantly oscillating and navigating different moral registers, different regimes of truth, and actually a more accurate portrait of Muslims and Islam, communities of Muslims, can be assessed through that gaze. So as I said, I'm not going to go into that too much, but of course we can pick that up in questions. I also borrow from and expand upon a number of concepts from post-colonial theoretical approaches. So just to give you a flavor, I can't actually see what I've got on the screen. So just give you a flavor, I engage with Barber's work on contact zone and third space, Stuart Hall's idea of becoming, cultural identity in diaspora, Paul Gilroy's concept of utopia, sort of creating a counter discourse of modernity or counter discourses of sort of accepted narratives or official narratives of the state, of the nation, and ideas of ethnic absolutism, which is sort of integrated within the state, and Olivier Roy's concept of global Islam, where he argues that in diaspora, the type of Islam that sort of second, third generation Muslims born in diaspora seem to be more enamored towards, is one which is stripped of its territorial link, deterritorialized, and of its cultural baggage, deculturalized. And he argues that this kind of Islam, which is more abstract, which is more based on a literal interpretation of the text, more in tune with revivalist or reformist movements that have popped up in the sort of colonial and post-colonial period. He argues that this kind of Islam is more attractive to youth born outside the Islamic heartlands. Okay. Okay, so here's a photograph of Dunstable Road in Luton. This is the major thoroughfare of Bury Park. This is where it all happens. A very vibrant, colourful place. As you can see, there are lots of different shops, Asian shops, mosques, people of predominantly South Asian origin, mingling and shopping and going about their day. This is the epicenter of the community there in Luton. Luton is a horrible town. Now, Luton, of course, is located in Bedfordshire, which is around 30 miles north of London. So it's not a remote town, but it's also quite a notorious town because it's known or has been known as a hotbed for radicalization and a site of fear. It has a long history and association with homegrown terrorism, not least the 7/7 bombers. This was the rendezvous point before they came into London. The Stockholm Bomber, the ISIS family that relocated, some ISIS fighters who were sort of politically active in Luton, were politically active from Luton. They've subsequently sort of perished while fighting, and there were links with the Westminster Bridge attacker as well. So this is, it's in the sort of wider discourse around British Muslims. Luton has been quite infamous in its reputation. And of course, Luton, as I mentioned earlier, is also infamous for being the hometown of Tommy Robinson and the birthplace of the EDL, the English Defence League, which is an anti-Muslim, racist, far-right organization. It's interesting because the EDL was actually formed off the back of protests organized by the Al-Muhajirun organization. Al-Muhajirun is a jihadist organization which was quite active. It's proscribed now, but at the time of research is quite active in the town. And they actually arranged an anti-protest against a homecoming march of a brigade that returned from Afghanistan. And people like Tommy Robinson were there to sort of usher in and celebrate their return. And they were very annoyed and angered by the counter-protest by members of Al-Muhajirun, who called them butchers of Baghdad and were criticizing the state. So that's the sort of origin of EDL, and it sort of snowballed into what it has recently. Of course, Tommy Robinson is no longer part of EDL. Again, we can come to that in a moment. I don't really have the time to go into it. So the early South Asian settlers of Bury Park were engaged in work, particularly manufacturing. The town was very famous for its manufacturing of hats and motor vehicles. And interestingly, a lot of the early Muslim arrivals actually were a result of an internal migration from northern towns. So a lot of the sort of older generation that I spoke with, they migrated because they lost their jobs in Bradford and factories in Bradford, for example, and came down to Luton because they had a relative here or a villager, fellow sort of somebody that they knew from their village in Pakistan, from Kodkli. So there's a lot of internal migration in the 60s that happened, and of course, wherever this has occurred in the UK context, there's been chain migration. So people have come as a result of other people going, and that sort of snowballed into creating a larger community. It's a post-industrial landscape. So from the sort of turn of the millennium, a lot of these manufacturing jobs that the older generation first took up were no longer available. They were made redundant, and many have diversified into the service and retail sector predominantly. Driving taxis is very common among men from all generations, owning small businesses, so grocery stores, fruit and veg stores, restaurants, takeaways. And a lot of this money is money earned is remitted back to Pakistan and Bangladesh, continuing that sort of post-war legacy of a remittance, sort of transnational remittance economy. So even though these jobs are no longer, the original jobs are no longer available, Lutonians have managed to diversify and keep working. For the younger generation, there's a bit of a tension and a conflict between the sort of expectations and lifestyles of the preceding generations. So here I've got Omar Love. Luton Omar was one of my friends, young friends in Luton. And he was very skeptical of the remittance economy, for example, links to Pakistan, because he considered himself as his quote, 100% English. And the reason why he thought he was 100% English was that, you know, it was his love for chicken and chips, you know, fried chicken and chips, which is very, very famous in Luton. I don't know how many there are. There are many chicken shops in Luton. Each one of them has their own special sauce. And for Omar, his affinity to Luton was primarily because he was familiar with it. He liked the food. He didn't like Pakistani food. He didn't like going back to Pakistan. He had his friends here, his sports clubs, his girlfriend, and he was very critical of the older generation and their sort of obsession with returning home. And another interesting insight is, unlike the older generation who were very sort of attached to their homeland, the younger generation were very, very much attached to Luton. So even though it might be a horrible town for Luton's Luton's younger generation, it wasn't a horrible town at all. They had a lot of ownership over it. They had a lot of pride around it. They considered it their own town, their own turf. So this is a very interesting intersection between loyalty to their locality, ambivalence towards the state, and complete rejection of their sort of ethnic root. Now, I was involved in the project through, my fieldwork was facilitated, through the Migrant Skills Project, what I call the Migrant Skills Project, which was the gateway into the field. This is a grassroots organization that was run by local Muslims of the Salafi denomination, who engaged with sort of rehabilitating young men who had been in prison or were likely to go into prison. They helped with employment services, so CV workshops and other things. But it was also a way for the organization to basically provide theological religious intervention to people who were seen to be going off the rails. And I came into the project as part of their action research grant to the European Union at the time, as part of the sort of social cohesion project, looking to de-radicalize potential, well, not de-radicalize, but to sort of prevent radicalization happening. So I was employed as a researcher on that project, where they went around and sort of spoke at schools and community centers and mosques, and spoke to young people and lectured them and sort of advised them on what true Islam is, as opposed to sort of violent, radical forms of Islam. So very much involved with the earlier iterations of the prevent strategy. Now I'm very mindful of the time, so I don't want to talk too much about this, but I should mention that I'm not from Luton. I grew up in Kingston in Surrey. I'm Bangladeshi in origin. And those of you who are familiar with Kingston will know that it's not a very Bangladeshi area. So I grew up in very much a minority, mostly a sort of white majority town. Growing up on a street where pretty much everyone on the road was from Bangladesh was completely alien to me. So this is a new experience. I should also mention that the vast majority, I mentioned this before, but the vast majority of my interlocutors were not Bangladeshi, although some were. The majority of them were Kashmiri or Pakistani of origin. So I had to learn Patwari, for example, dialects of Punjabi. So whether or not I'm a native anthropologist is up for question. I always find that a difficult concept to internalize, but maybe we can talk about that later if you wish. Okay, so the Muslim community in Luton is indicative, as I mentioned, of a wider post-war settlement trend in the UK. The British Nationality Act of 1948 was instrumental in much of this sort of post-war migration, the Windrush generation, etc. So workers, mainly men in the first wave, came as a result of the sort of opening up of the colonies, the ex-colonies, and some were still colonies at the time. In the first wave, you had mainly men answering the call to come to work. Male relatives then joined in the second wave, of initial primary migrants, and then wives and children arrived in the third wave. So this was facilitated, this sort of wave structure was facilitated by the Immigration Act of 62, 68, and 71. And it sort of permanently dispelled, these pieces of legislation permanently dispelled this myth of return that a lot of migrants had. A lot of migrant men wanted to come to England, make a quick buck, return, you know, and invest what they made back home. But they couldn't do that because of the tightening of immigration rules. So in the end, actually, the opposite effect of the immigration tightening happened. It was tightened to restrict migration. But in the aftermath of the introduction, it accelerated chain migration. So lots of people who were relatives and people from villages in South Asia realized that time was short, so they arrived in the UK. And with 1971 Immigration Act, that was the Family Reunification Act. It meant that if you're already resident in the UK, you could bring your wives, if you're most were men, if you bring your wives and children. So instead of restricting migration and restricting the other, what these pieces of legislation did actually was permanently change the social fabric of British society, because these generations are now in the third and fourth iteration. So it's only increased the migrant presence in the UK, one could argue. The older generation were very keen to instill a memory of migration. So work ethic, we came here with nothing, we're only here to work. Britain is a very sort of prudent place to work and provide for your family. They had a strong sense of clan loyalty, again, coming back from rural areas where sort of patrilineal groups were very much a political and social unit. So this was instilled within diaspora contexts. And they're also very keen to travel to South Asia, both themselves, the older generation, but also to take their children there on ancestral tourism trips, for example. So the memory of migration was very potent among my interlocutors. There was also sort of ideology of shame and honor, or the ideology of izzat that Pnina Verbner talks about in some detail. And this was particularly relevant when it came to relationships, romantic relationships and marriage. And it affected women more than it did men, because the honor of the clan is very patrilineal, it's very patriarchal. The honor of the man is contingent on the character of its womenfolk. Therefore, marriage and relationships were very much policed, and my interlocutors were very much aware of that, and they were very much sort of the spectre of not bringing shame to the family or bestie to the family was quite strong. I've put misogyny there on the slide. I did sense a lot of sort of misogynistic attitudes among the young men that I worked with. There was a clear sort of demarcation of gender roles. And power and agency. I mean, in their everyday actions, there was ambivalence, there was sort of contradictions of what they said they believed in, but nevertheless, this was an issue which was sort of almost endorsed by patriarchal structures or ideologies of honor and shame. There was another tension between the younger generations and the older generations, where people were the older generation expected the younger generation to be loyal to the family and clan, wider biradri, or gushti, as would be said in Bengali. But the younger generation actually were very critical of that, and they resorted to Islam, interestingly, as a way to counter that. So here we've got a quote from one of my key interlocutors, who was an imam of one of the mosques. People should be loyal to God, not to their blood. There was a tension between what people called village culture versus universal religion. And young Muslims engaged in all sorts of tactics and trying to sort of push their agenda forward, legitimizing it through sort of religious scripture. So, for example, in marriage, young people are arguing that they could marry anybody they wanted to. Men argued that they could marry Jews and Christians according to the text, and that it wasn't necessary that they had to marry somebody that they were related to, their cousin in Pakistan or here or wherever else up north, and that actually it was wrong and haram on the parents to wish that and expect that of them. So this was the sort of basis of a lot of discussions and debates that were happening intergenerationally. This quote is interesting because despite the debates that were happening, there is still a strong sense of respect and sort of obedience to the older generation. So this is Shahid, who was 19 at the time. Given a choice, I want to marry someone outside the biradari. I have to be able to get along with her and share the same interests. I don't think any of my cousins fit that role, and I don't really know the ones in Pakistan. But in the end, I know I'm going to have to go with whoever my parents like. I'm just going to have to say no until I like someone they like. But I'm not really thinking about that now. I want to finish my degree and get a job. Maybe then the situation will be different, who knows? So that ambivalence was very key and very salient of whether or not they should do what is expected of them or whether or not they should do what they're sort of what they want, essentially. Okay, so here's another chapter in the book entitled Friends. In this one, the book explores the role of work and leisure in the lives of young Muslim men. So it's important to note that British-born Muslims in Luton were invariably schooled and socialized in the UK. And so therefore there's a relative diversification of employment and more leisure time compared to the previous generations who had to work a lot of hours, double shifts, sometimes 7 days a week. They didn't have the time to sort of, or didn't have that much time to spend with leisure activities. And also the kind of jobs that they did were quite limited as well, whereas the younger generation have a bit more diversity on that front. The vast majority of my interlocutors were friends with people in their local community, usually other men, and they were usually of Asian or Muslim origin. Now, this is obviously typical of any community up and down the country. You're obviously going to be friends with people you went to school with in your neighborhood. But the actual sort of groupings of friends that I came across was largely with other Muslims or other Asians. There's a healthy sprinkling of Asian and Hindu communities there as well, and also some other Arab Muslims as well, although they're much less. So the chapter also explores notions of masculinity, particularly in the context of economic activity. This was really highly regarded. Everybody wanted to earn, a lot of money, and there was pressure from home to earn as well. It was seen as shameful if somebody was indolent or lazy or didn't sort of provide for the family. There's also a strong current of conspicuous consumption. So wealth was on display, fast cars, expensive cars, jewelry, clothes, very sort of an agentive materialism was quite pervasive among the young people that I worked with, and there was an aggressive heteronormativity. So they were very much interested in women, very homophobic in a lot of attitudes, and very much sort of all had aspirations to have a family one day, wife, children, live in Luton, help the family. So very cogent sense of masculinity related to work life and protecting the family unit being very a strong sort of referent. And they shared the workplace with friends and family. This is very interesting as well. A lot of my interlocutors who were in managerial positions in retail jobs and so forth vouch for their friends to come and work for them. And so in some of these establishments, you've got groups of friends working. They also got into joint business ventures, so very entrepreneurial, opening up takeaways and fast food outlets. But what was really interesting actually was a lot of the young people that I came across were involved in drug dealing as well. Luton is a centre for the drugs trade. I've been told by very reliable sources in Luton, including the Bedfordshire Police. And whereas once the trade was handled by other ethnic communities in the town, recently the trade is actually controlled by Muslim gangs who have links with other gangs in the north, Manchester, Bradford, and others. And so the sort of trickle-down effect of that, if you like, is a lot of young people in teens got quite easy jobs and easy money, working for cousins who were already older and were involved in the trade, or people they knew from the neighborhood that were involved in the trade. And of course, dealing drugs comes with conspicuous consumption. A lot of these drug dealers drove very expensive cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, up and down Dunstable Road. They were very ocular, very present, and they were very much admired by a lot of my young interlocutors. So here we've got a quote from my friend who was a youth worker, Mukhlis, in the town. They grow up idolizing these big gangsters they hear stories about, who they see around the neighborhood in their flashy, expensive cars, wearing expensive clothes and jewelry. It's also a bravado thing. Being a gangster means you're tough and powerful. For them, it's the ultimate sign of manhood. They hear stories about shootings and fights. They're impressed by the danger of that kind of life. And so related to that, beyond work, I mean, I suppose dealing also sort of affects social life as well. But within social spaces and leisure, as I mentioned at the top, there's a lot more that young people could do compared to their parents and grandparents. And usually it's a sort of leisure and socializing occurred at school, at university, those of them who went to university. Sports and social clubs, these are very important. There was a lot of youth clubs at the time of research in Luton, and they were heavily, they were oversubscribed at times. Lots of sports clubs, football, cricket, very popular among young people. Holidays abroad, of course, Luton's got an airport and EasyJet cheap tickets to very exotic party destinations, which a lot of young men took up. And also socializing in the workplace, particularly those who sort of work with each other. So here's a lovely quote from Amin, who was 23 at the time. Amin is an interesting person. He was a poet, a history teacher, and a semi-professional footballer. He was a goalkeeper. He played for a league team, a professional league team. Eric Cantona, this is, for those of you unaware, is a French footballer who was very popular in the UK in the 90s, represented everything that I was and wanted to be. He wasn't ethnically English, neither am I. He was temperamental, so am I. He always got into trouble with the authorities, so did I. As a footballer, he was the best. Nobody came close. That's what I wanted to be. All my friends, whether they were Muslim, black, white, Sikh, or whatever, respected Cantona. Football brought us together. Cantona made us equal. So this, I think, is really interesting, sort of engaging with an iconic figure of the 90s, a popular figure that lots of young people up and down the country, regardless of whether they were Muslim or not, identified with at the time. And I like the way that Amin sort of weaves in his own experiences with racism, race and ethnicity, and finds a way of sort of identifying with wider popular culture in the UK. Okay, so one of the key findings, I'm going to move on very quickly, I'm mindful of the time. This is the final chapter of the book, Religion. And one of the key findings was that religious identity among British-born Muslims was stronger than ethnic identity. So most people very proudly identified as British Muslim, and much less people identified as British Pakistani or British Bangladeshi. For example, among the younger generation. The older generation was a bit different. A lot of the older generation didn't even consider themselves to be British. It was just, Pakistani. But the younger generation were far more comfortable in calling themselves British. They were very proud to be British, but also British Muslim as their sort of primary suffixed identity. Also, young Muslims, another sort of major finding was that young Muslims were very critical of South Asian variants of Islam, particularly Barelvism, among my Pakistani interlocutors, and were very keen to follow what they called pure Islam, devoid of cultural baggage. So the type of Islam that wasn't located at a particular region, South Asia, that wasn't very magical, wasn't very mystical, that didn't rely on intercession, didn't rely on all innovations outside of the scripture. So very much reformist and revivalist, if you like, proclivity. So Islam was both an ethical practice and a political cultural identity. And I found that very interesting as well. It wasn't just a way of improving oneself, becoming a better person, thinking about the afterlife, linking things to ontology and sort of temporalities. but it was also an identity. It was a political identity in defiance almost of wider perceptions towards the Muslim community and towards the folk devil of Muslim men. So young Muslims, even though they lived in this very sort of close-knit community, were very, very much aware of wider perceptions of Muslims and of Luton of being a hotbed of radicalization. And they had very agentive, thought out, critical responses to that. And one of them was to hold on to their Islamic identity rather than reject it in the face of hostility and criticism. And one of the concepts that sort of helped facilitate that was the idea of the Ummah, which of course is mentioned in the Quran and also by Prophet Muhammad himself in the Hadith literature. I've got a couple of quotes there. One from the Quran: "Indeed, all Muslims are brothers," and I've got a hadith there. The example of Muslims in their mutual love, mercy, and sympathy is that of a body. If one of the organs is afflicted, the whole body responds with sleeplessness and fever, which is very powerful. Lots of people knew these verses off by heart. The Ummahs are interesting because it sort of links in with, as I mentioned at the top, the revivalist groups and their idea of sort of back to basics Islam, stripping it of all cultural innovations and anything that falls beyond the idea of sort of the doctrines of Tawheed and monotheism. It was also really interesting because young Muslims found a way of being solid, having solidarity with other Muslims around the world who are facing sort of tumult and turmoil and oppression. And they identified with that as some sort of utopian space. And there was a lot of people who are quite active in campaigning against the occupation of Palestine, for example, or the war in Syria and other things. So they're very, very much involved in conceptualizing the global Muslim community as their own community, and that they're very much invested in what happens with that community. The point I'm trying to make with the Ummah, that it was a good sort of antidote to wider perceptions of Muslims being some sort of threat to sort of British national culture, national collective, and a lot of my interlocutors actually explicitly mentioned that we are British, but we're also connected to the worldwide Muslim community. They are also part of our identity. So this links into this idea of globalized Islam, deterritorialized, deculturalized, diaspora-friendly, Sharia-based or text-based, which sort of eradicates the cultural baggage, as many would argue, and goes back to that sort of pristine environment of Muhammad in Mecca and where all the sort of scripture comes from. So I'm just going to end very quickly with a couple of quotes. In Pakistan, this is how they learn about Islam. He's talking about, and this is Abbas was 18, he's talking about his madrasa after-school education in Luton. In Pakistan, this is how they learn about Islam. They know Urdu, so they can ask questions and get a better understanding. But here, most of us weren't interested in going to the mosque after school. And when we were there, our questions never got answered because the Imam didn't care or we couldn't understand him. We should get taught about Islam by people who can speak English so we can understand our religion better. And this is something that the Salafi mission is very much aware of and has capitalized on a lot. And I've got one other quote in this one. This is Zulfikar, who was 25, who was a Salafi Muslim. When I first started university, I only knew what the local Imam and what my parents had taught me, but I was very interested in religion. I was questioning a lot of things as I was growing up. A lot of the things the community didn't make any sense to me. The peers or saints and the magic and all that, I just didn't believe in all that. It just seemed really backward and stupid. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly sum up these parts. I'm just going to read through them, so I'll be done in 30 seconds, I think.
That's okay. You can take your time. It's all right.
Thank you very much. So just a summary of the findings. Berry Park's ethnic enclave is a legacy of post-war labor migrations. Second and third generation South Asian Muslims strategically conform to the conventions and protocols of the home and community in varied ways. So there's a lot of ambivalence going here. There's a lot of sort of strategizing and tactics. Although many are critical of the application of South Asian culture in Britain, a potent sense of respect and cooperation towards parents' wishes and aspirations was generally upheld, particularly regarding marriage. So again, this is very interesting. There's reproduction going on in a sort of more watered down sense than previous generations. Socialization predominantly with fellow Muslims and other Asians, financial obligations to the family, a will to work, this was very strong, a conscious Muslim identity provided a sense of solidarity and emotive belonging situated in opposition to wider social profiling in the sort of spectre of post-7/7 Britain. an attraction to pan-Islamic revivalist variants of Islam. So those variants of Islam were very popular in Luton among my interlocutors because they could access the text, they could speak to the preachers in English, they can go to the talks, which were always delivered in English. And dual loyalties, refashioning new narratives of what it means to be British in the 20th century. So a lot of my interlocutors didn't have any problem in being British and Muslim. They felt that that was a perfectly acceptable identity. They were British, they identified with everyone in the UK, but they also identified with the international community of Muslims, the Ummah, which gave them dual loyalties.